Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's November 2020 program, Rewriting the History of Oregon. This is the 11th program of our 2021 programming year. My name is Scott Coltrane, and I'm the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, and are rebroadcast on public radio station KLCC FM 89.7 on Mondays at 7 p.m. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, UO has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. We would also like to acknowledge the generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. On to today's program. The Thanksgiving holiday ahead celebrates a relationship between Pilgrims and Native Americans that is mythic in nature, weaving together fact and fiction. Local stories of the arrival of Oregon pioneers aren't much different. In this season, it is appropriate to ask, who wrote the history behind these myths, and what were their goals? In writing Oregon's history, what was included and what was left out? We need to consider what really happened when white settlers encountered Oregon's indigenous people in the 1800s, and what that means for our Northwest today. Many of us learned a simple, heroic story of the foundation of Oregon in school, focused on Lewis and Clark, fur traders, and covered wagons. In truth, the first white settlers in Oregon were initially well known to have been brutal, violent conquerors. In the decades that followed, the writers of Oregon's historical narratives clashed over whether to isolate or celebrate the violence. Eventually, they converged on an open strategy of erasure, nourishing a false nostalgia for a peaceful colonization that never was. Oregon's violent history was imperfectly hidden from view. In today's program, Mark Carpenter and Jennifer ONeal will focus on how Oregon's history has been written and rewritten, what steps were taken to shape incomplete narratives, and how they work and collaborate with Native American communities to tell more true and accurate accounts of this history. I would like to thank Joel Corin, past City Club President and currently Chair of the City Club Program Committee, for coordinating this program and for serving as moderator today. Mark Carpenter is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Oregon. His research and writings focus on the history of relationships between white settlers and indigenous people in the Northwest during the first century of American colonization. He has published articles in the Oregon Historical Quarterly, the Pacific Historical Review, and soon the American Indian Quarterly, and has co-written a book on the Oregon State Park system that will appear in 2021. Carpenter earned a BA in history from Portland State University and an MA in history from Pennsylvania State University. Jennifer ONeal is an acting assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of Oregon, and affiliated faculty with the History Department and the Robert D. Clark Honors College. Her interdisciplinary research and teaching examine the social, political, and historical intersections of Native American, United States, and international relations with an emphasis on sovereignty, self-determination, cultural heritage, activism, and legal issues. Her work is also dedicated to centering Indigenous traditional knowledge, applying decolonizing methodologies, and implementing place-based education. She earned a master's degree in history from Utah State University and a master's degree in information science from the University of Arizona. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at Georgetown University, and in 2019 received the Henry Rowe Cloud Dissertation Fellowship from Yale University. She is an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde in Oregon.
Hi there, my name is Mark Carpenter, and I research the memory, commemoration, and erasure of settler violence in Oregon and Washington from the late 1840s through to the 1920s and beyond. And throughout those periods, there was a shared desire among most Euro-Americans for a heroic mythopoetic story of how the United States took over the Pacific Northwest. And thus there was a shared problem among would-be history makers of the cold historical reality that colonial conquest was and is inextricably and sometimes notoriously linked to theft, to rape, to murder, and to attempted genocide in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere. Euro-Americans trying to shape history face the same problem, but across different organizations, different decades, different audiences, and different authors, there were divergent attempts to try and carve a heroic history out of the horrific reality of colonialism, and different and often contrary decisions made about what to celebrate, what to exclude, and what to cover up. And I use the term cover up with some care. One of the interventions of my research, and one of the ones I want to focus on today, is showing that early generations of history makers deliberately covered up the worst excesses of colonial violence. They valued heroism more than they valued fact, and they tainted the historical record in ways that still affect us and historical memory today. The core evidence that I use in my research, certainly the core new evidence, comes from the records of those who tried to shape the Euro-American story of colonial conquest in the decades that it was taking place and in the decades that followed. So that includes the records of historians, local and regional, amateur and professional, who often carefully curated away stories of colonial violence that didn't fit their heroic histories. That includes a great number of pioneer reminiscences and pioneer journals, which were often much more frank about the violence that the pioneers themselves had inflicted when they were being written for private audiences or local audiences. And in fact, in some cases, I found the evidence of them cleaning up their own violent acts in preparation for publication for the general public. And I look at the records of various societies that tried to shape history. So pioneer societies, the first historical societies, heritage groups, like the Daughters of the American Revolution, Indian War veterans groups, all these organizations that first shaped how the so-called pioneer generation would be remembered in the decades that followed. And all Indigenous histories and Indigenous stories have already told us, have been telling us for decades and centuries how horrific the violent conquest of the Pacific Northwest was. What my work does is confirm the extent of that violence using the records of the perpetrators and the records of those who covered it up. So probably the most famous act of colonial violence in Oregon was the Lupton Massacre of 1855, which happened outside of modern-day Roseburg. In the fall of 1855, amid escalating tensions, a man named James Lupton, who had been dreaming of killing local Indigenous people for years, found his chance. He met with local Shasta and Takelma bands promising peace. Shasta and Takelma were local Indigenous polities and communities. Then he rallied together like-minded would-be killers from among the Euro-American miners and farmers of the region. Lupton told these men that because he had promised peace to the local Native communities, it would be easy to, and I quote, massacre them while off their guard. He got a number of volunteers for this purpose. He snuck up on a nearby encampment that they knew to be more or less unarmed, made up mostly of women and children, in the dead of night, and began murdering them just before dawn. They killed at least 30 people, probably more. It's not clear how many more. First attacking while the camp was still asleep, killing people in their beds, then shooting people as they ran away, then taking hostages and threatening to kill them unless their family members came out to be shot in turn. And it was while threatening a hostage that James Lupton himself was shot, the only Euro-American fatality in this massacre. So the Lupton Massacre is arguably the most famous act of colonial violence in Oregon, but I'm willing to bet that many of the non-native Oregonians watching or hearing this have not previously heard about it. It was famous in its time, in part because it was seen as an inciting incident for the escalating series of wars between the United States and Indigenous nations across the Pacific Northwest that reached a crescendo following the Lupton Massacre in 1855 and 1856. And it became famous, it became reported nationally, in part because US officers, particularly the officer in charge of the region, General John Wool, complained about it, worried about it, because they supported efforts to steal land from Native communities without the loss of life and financial cost that war entailed. But the Lupton Massacre was not an anomaly. It may have been the most famous, but there were other mass killings and other smaller, still lethal acts of violence in the Pacific Northwest of the 1850s and 60s and beyond. In Northwest Washington in 1856, a man named Hamilton Maxon perpetrated an almost identical massacre of unarmed and fleeing Nisqually people along the Nisqually River, brutally killing, again, at least 30, probably more. And one of the things that struck me most reading through pioneer reminiscences and journals is just how many other attempts and dreams of genocide there were. Euro-Americans with guns banding together to try and murder any and all Native people they came across were a perennial occurrence in colonial Oregon in the 1850s and beyond. Often, Native communities, Native groups were able to outwit, outrun, or outfight the Euro-American aggressors, and thus were able to prevent the acts of genocide they intended. Sometimes, as in the case of the Lupton and Maxon massacres, they weren't. One of the most haunting sources I've found is a 6-volume unpublished autobiography by a man named Loren L. Williams, who was a serial killer of Native people from when he arrived in Oregon in 1851 to his death in the late 1870s. Sometimes Williams murdered as a soldier. He was a lieutenant in the US Army in 1865 when he ordered his men to commit genocide and, if necessary, cannibalism in their unsuccessful attempt to, quote, exterminate Northern Paiute communities in southeastern Oregon. Sometimes Williams killed as a civilian, as when he shot at least 2 Native people in cold blood in 1875 outside of any war because they, quote, looked suspicious. Sometimes when Williams killed, he was sort of a soldier and sort of a civilian. When he arrived in Oregon, it was as an unenlisted irregular auxiliary of the Army, not on formal roles, but nonetheless vaguely under the command of Army officers. And he committed various acts of murder and theft across the region of what's now Port Orford in southwestern Oregon just after his arrival. And Williams was not alone. There were other killers like him, among them, quote, the nicknamed man, Big Frank, the inspiration for the Pioneer statue that until this last summer stood at the center of the University of Oregon campus. Williams and Lupton and Big Frank were, to quote the sculptor of that statue, men for whom killing the occasional Indian was all in a day's work. Sometimes these men were soldiers, sometimes they weren't. They didn't see much difference between it. To quote yet another one, they were, quote, fighting Indians before they joined the Army, the same as they were in the Army. What they shared was a readiness to kill Native people where and when they could. And men like Williams, Maxon, Hamilton acted with impunity because they knew that Euro-American society at the time would cheer them on or at worst put up with them. genocide was popular in Oregon and Washington in the mid-19th century. I've seen many letters of pioneer men and women who support mass murder. One woman named Abigail Malek, who lived in what's now Clark County, considered participation in mass killing a worthy trait for a would-be son-in-law, and specified in her letters to her family out east that she hoped the soldiers would kill all the men and the women of the Native communities they fought against, although she used racial slurs that I won't repeat rather than men and women. Objections to genocide, when they occurred, were often framed as practical rather than moralistic. George Ambrose, the Indian agent for Southern Oregon at the time of the Lupton Massacre, objected to attempted genocide because he predicted correctly that it would lead to wars in which Euro-Americans would die. But among his objections, he also stipulated that he did support mass murder in theory. He just didn't think it would work. There were moral objections from some Euro-Americans, which with a few exceptions tended to take the form of sternly worded letters. There were Euro-Americans who would mourn mass murder, but very few seem to have even considered the possibility of prosecuting the wanton killers of Native people for their crimes. And because of this, men like Williams, Lupton, Hamilton, Big Frank, and many others knew they could kill without legal consequence. They were supported by much of the white community and largely unthreatened by the rest. Sometimes, perhaps often, a fear of reprisal from Native communities held them in check, but not for long and not forever. And these kinds of sordid killings, especially the famous ones like the Lupton Massacre, posed a problem for early historians of Oregon who wanted to tell a simple story of happy history. The first few historians dealt with this problem by severing the stories of unjust violence from the rest of colonial conquest. They took the records of military figures and Indian agents who had objected to the cost of genocide and portrayed them instead as enlightened humanitarians. They reported without much evidence that the average settler had regretted the violence, that they'd done nothing to stop. You might say these first historians blamed attempted genocide, as it was broadly perceived, on a few bad apples, rather than on the very real structural racism that had driven it. And most of them glossed over the popular support for murder shared among so many of the Euro-American colonizers to condemn just a few of the worst contenders. But even this was too much for the next generation of historians who set the script for how history was told in Oregon and Washington, and who attempted to blot out histories of Euro-American iniquitous violence entirely. Probably the most shameless of the early historians I studied was a man named Elwood Evans, a lawyer, politician, and historian who helped to found the Washington State Historical Society. He insisted to his grave that Euro-Americans had never been the aggressors in any conflict with Native people anywhere. This was and is patently and provably ludicrous, but Elwood Evans made it a mission to deny, bury, or at least disrupt as much of the voluminous historical evidence of murders and massacres as he could. He always used the rhetoric of a scholar. He always sounded like a historian, but he used no standard of evidence other than what would make people like him look good. He did report some violence because he saw violent colonizers as heroes, as he said, soldiers for the Americanization of the wilderness. But in Evans's telling, that violence was always heroic, always applied only against men, and always defensive. He denied the Lupton Massacre, which was well documented in government and newspaper sources at the time, by judging those sources as unreliable. Evans insisted that only the accounts of white men who had been there during the killings could be trusted. But then, a few years later, he also denied the Maxon Massacre. In this case, the evidence for it was in fact from the white men who had been there. So now, in this case, Evans insisted instead that only government sources could be trusted because they didn't show a massacre. In other words, to Evans and other historians like him, the kind of source didn't matter, the consistency of evidence didn't matter, the overwhelming goal was to paint Euro-Americans in a positive light and to deny any violence they deemed offensive. And by the 20th century, it was standard practice for Euro-Americans to downplay, ignore, or cover up unjust violence perpetrated by white pioneers. They did know about the violence. I know that because I found records of it in their archives, out of sight, but they didn't let it into their books most of the time. And there was what was known as the Pioneer Code, which, to quote historian Clarence Bagley, was to rake up no old stories of evil. They covered it up. They didn't cover up entirely successfully. They weren't uniform in this cover-up. There were exceptions, but there was a general adherence to a cover-up. And that cover-up has shaped and has tainted what everyday people learn about the history of the Pacific Northwest for generations. I grew up in Oregon. I went to public schools in Oregon. And what I learned about the period I now study was very close to what Bagley and the other rake up no old stories of evil historians like him taught. I learned about Lewis and Clark and covered wagons and a kind of happy, jolly story. Embarrassingly, I didn't even know there had been wars in Oregon until I was a few years into a history degree in college. Good people have been struggling to change these popular narratives for decades, and there has been progress, but we're still only just beginning. And there are still active erasures. Abigail Malek, the pioneer woman who supported mass killings, the one book I found about her, written just 20 years ago, snipped out every reference to her support for genocide, sometimes from the middle of quotations from her letters and diaries, because the author of that book wanted her to be a hero. There are still, to this day, plenty of would-be history makers, amateur and professional, who deeply want to rake up no old stories of evil. I have a kind of thought I want to share before I turn this over to Jennifer ONeal to talk about some of the great work that's being done to disrupt these old narratives. There's a very human urge when we're confronted with two radically different stories to teach the controversy and to find the middle. To get one story that says one thing, one story that says a different thing, and end up somewhere in the middle between those two narratives. And there are many, many times where that is appropriate, where the truth is hard to find, where the truth is somewhere in the middle. But part of the point of my work is that in many places, what appears to be two stories is actually the same story and a cover-up. In many cases, once you get down into the nitty-gritty of pioneer reminiscences and journals, the pioneer memory and Indigenous history agree on the violence of colonial conquest in Oregon. They might have different opinions about the validity of it. They might have a slightly different gloss of the events, but they agree on the essentials of it. The controversy and uncertainty comes not from the people who were there, not from the original records, but from the first generation of early historians who wanted and pursued a cover-up with some success. There are plenty of times where we should teach the controversy, where the story is complicated, where the history is unclear. But there are other times where the truth is simple, and the only controversy is how long it has taken for historians to recognize the lies of their predecessors. Thank you, and I'd love to turn it over to Jennifer ONeal.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer ONeal. It's an honor to be with you today. I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and as such, I would love to be able to honor and recognize that I'm coming from you from Kalapuya Ilihi, which is the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people. And as such, I recognize that they were dispossessed of their Indigenous homeland by the US government and white settlers over several years, but most notably in treaties between 1851 and 1855. And because of this forcible removal, they are now citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, and continue to make important contributions to the communities across the state of Oregon, at the University of Oregon, and across the land that we now refer to as Oregon. So I want to make sure we honor and recognize the people whose homeland we are meeting on today. So what I'm going to be talking with you today is building off of the amazing presentation by Mark. I'm also going to be talking about a couple different projects that I have been working on here at the University of Oregon to really bring focus to particularly the histories and the erasure of Native American people, particularly on campus. And so I've been here at the University of Oregon since 2012. And since then have had the honor to work with some other amazing faculty and staff across campus in doing this work, and wanted to share a couple different projects that we've been involved with that are really aiming toward really bring awareness to not only just Native American history, but the importance of ways that we can really disrupt the inaccurate narratives that have been told about Native American people, not only across the state, but particularly here in our city and on our campus. So the first project I want to highlight is called Untold Stories, the Hidden History of the University of Oregon. So this project is really dedicated to highlighting the often untold and hidden histories of traditionally underrepresented students and diverse communities through the context of the built environment on the University of Oregon campus. Too often these histories are hidden within the confines of decades of oppression, discrimination, and settler colonialism. Specifically the histories of the university's diverse student leaders and groups, which are rich in histories and stories of heroism, activism, and defiance, but often remain unknown or hidden across campus and just in general. And so with this project, we sought to bring these stories into the center of campus history through actual written narratives, as well as tours to key sites and related histories. To give some background, this project really started through a partnership between myself and Dr. Kevin Hatfield. Together, we teach a freshman interest group since 2013. And that freshman interest group, for those of you who are not aware of what that is it's really this core set of classes that freshmen take together that are centered around a theme. And so our theme for our course is called Hidden History. And through that, they take 2 courses together, and then as well as a college connections course. And those courses that they take together are often introductory history classes and ethnic studies courses to really delve into some of these core questions that we're investigating around American West history, race, ethnicity, problematic issues surrounding settler colonialism. And so through these courses, we're really delving into these topics. And as Kevin and I began to start to teach this FIG, something that we wanted to do was really introduce students not only to this history, but also to the built environment of campus, and helping them to understand what are some problematic issues that arise when we actually think about the built environment, and also its connection to place-based learning. So beginning in 2013 is really when we started to launch this project, Untold Stories. And it also happened to be at the same time prior to beginning and now being an assistant professor in the Department of Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies. Previously, I served as the university historian. And at that same time, I was beginning a project called the Documenting UO project. And as part of that, again, this was a larger project to begin to reveal a lot of this diverse history, specifically working with and engaging with students and student groups, particularly those representing underrepresented groups and students of color, and really helping to not only document their histories, their records, but also to tell their stories and to tell it from their perspectives. So both of these projects were happening simultaneously and really helped to launch this project. So the stories and our tour development really stemmed them from not only the Hidden History FIG, but also the Documenting UO History project. So as we began to teach the FIG, it was with the goal of identifying gaps in records and documentation about the histories of underrepresented groups on campus. And this work was really grounded in community-based and participatory documentation by the groups represented. So that means that when we were undertaking this work, we saw ourselves more as the facilitators, the historians that were trying to talk with these groups, conduct the oral histories, but that they are the experts on these histories, and they are the ones that really knew these histories. They knew the people, they knew the really intricate stories of their activism, who might have other records, as well as just the important stories that needed to be told. And this also in turn helped students to understand what it actually is to be a historian and what that looks like. So in collaboration with our FIG class and student archive assistants, we worked directly with various student leaders and groups to identify key stories to documents related to their experiences on campus, as well as identified archival materials for possible donation. So through the FIG course, we provide an opportunity for undergraduates to investigate these histories, to reconstruct the past, develop student-created research outputs, and then share these stories with the wider university community. So rather than being a class about just passive consumption of history, this project really provides students with an inquiry-based historical thinking model that really positions students as active producers of history, and also at the same time questioning much of what they probably previously learned in high school or didn't learn probably much of anything about Native Americans. So this is really an opportunity, and often the first time they're hearing a lot of this history. So it really, again, models this, so students are active producers of history, while also understanding the ethics, protocols, and methodology when you work with community partners, and really centering the community partners' perspectives. So through collaboration and shared decision-making about these research agendas, modes of inquiry, and dissemination of knowledge, this project positions students to create new knowledge, contribute original research to a growing body of scholarship and creative work by historians, journalists, filmmakers, artists who are actively trying to bring awareness and revealing the hidden history of campus for future generations. And these stories represented not only in the work they're doing and the tours that we created, reflect this research and seek to really fill those gaps in traditional histories of campus. So not only was this a project that had this really tangible outcome for the students and something that not only students and faculty and campus members, but community members could do, really the goal behind it was developing a curriculum where the students could really have tangible outcomes from this. So again, this was a project not just for our class, but also that other faculty, other educators could use in their classrooms, so that it wasn't just something that was used once and couldn't be used again, but we saw it as something that could be replicated and used in future classes or in other ways. So it was really with the aim of utilizing an online application as a teaching and learning tool. And the online application I'm talking about is the actual tours we created through this website, which we will share out as part of this presentation. Again, using these tools across disciplines to seek to bring this awareness. And depending on specific disciplines, we had some learning objectives that could be implemented when utilizing the tool. Things like just improving understanding of complex history of race relations, diversity, settler colonialism, and specifically how it related to the UO campus and to the state of Oregon, and even Lane County in particular. And then, of course, critically engaging these essential questions about race, ethnicity, gender, settler colonial history, and developing an understanding of the concepts and practice and ethics of decolonizing and methodology and social justice. What does that look like? How do you implement that in a classroom? How do you work with tribal community partners? And just in general, increasing awareness of and gaining a sense of empathy for diverse historical actors, which was really at the core of doing this work. And of course, using primary sources. Just what is the act that we do as historians, and how do we work with primary sources? Not only tangible primary sources, but also tribal elders and other community partners who are primary sources themselves. So that's a huge part of why we do this work, is to teach there are other things and other resources as primary sources. So the first phase of this project really launched in the fall of 2018, when we did 10 separate stories highlighting African American, Asian American, and Native American students, faculty, and staff histories related to sites across campus. So all of the stories that we highlighted had to be directly connected to a specific site on campus. This is an ongoing project, and so as stories are completed, they're continue to be added to the website and these different story sections. So again, we continue to add to this as we go along. That this has just been a first phase, particularly over these past couple of years. And the reason is because this isn't just something that we see as having an end, but it is a continual project that we will continue to add to as we work with community partners, with students, staff, and faculty, and it can continue to grow into something that is best served by those people that we work with. So we continue to add content content, so you can check back for that as we add that. I want to highlight a couple different communities that we've worked with and highlight how they've added to the project and how we continue to do that work. One is, in addition to working with the FIG, we've also worked with the Native American and Indigenous Studies academic residential community, which is here at the University of Oregon. So as part of that, I, along with two other professors, Dr. Kirby Brown and Dr. Brian Klopotic, serve as the co-directors of this academic residential community, and as such also wanted to contribute to ways that our group and this student community, which includes freshmen, Native American and ally students who are part of this group, to also contribute to the bringing awareness of Native American histories and people. So specifically for this project, is so they could really connect to this built environment, and that since campus also functions as the site of erasure for Native American people, how could we work with this group to really recenter Native American history on campus? So in working with the seminar class that we teach for this class, the students identified, developed, and contributed in 30 different significant Native American locations on campus. And we actually worked with GIS mapping on campus and embedded these sites into the UO map. And so now there is a distinctive map embedded within the UO campus map called Indigenous UO. And if you go on to that site, again, we will share this link out, you can see over 30 different locations. This is everything from basic things like art installations to specific buildings with programs and activities related to Native students. It also highlights the tribal flagpoles that are at the center of campus. And within each of those locations, not only does it give the specific site, it also gives a basic overview. And if you want to know more, it also links out to stories and to websites and different other locations that you might be interested in. So this is really a way that we are physically embedding Native American history, people, lifeways into this built environment of campus, which is really important. And we, again, similar to the larger Hidden History project, as part of this class, we continue to build out this project, and we'll be continue to work and interview Native American alumni and community members to add to the map and add to this larger archive of history. The final project I wanted to highlight is an activity that has really led to helping us to create other ideas about ways that we can continue to honor Native people on campus. As part of these different classes, both the ARC and the FIG, we are honored every fall to be taken on tours of the Kalapuya Talking Stones, which are located in Alton Baker Park. And these are stones that were put in place by the Citizens Planning Committee and by Kalapuya descendants, particularly Esther Stutzman, a tribal elder of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz. And as part of that, these are physical stones that were placed that have Kalapuya words on them, and there are 15 stones. And as part of our tours, we take students around and do interpretations of the history of Kalapuya people. We are also honored to have other tribal elders like Marta Lou Clifford, who is a Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde tribal elder, and also a elder in residence with the theater department. And so as part of that, both of these tribal elders give of their time to provide traditional knowledge and understanding to students to have a connection with Kalapuya tribal history and to recenter that history in the knowledge and in our curriculum, which we are so honored to have. So as part of this work, we've really thought largely about, well, how could we possibly do something very similar here on our own campus? So we're really thinking about ways that we could make a proposal to our campus to have something similar put in place that would really honor and recognize the Kalapuya people. And again, this is all part of a collaboration between tribal community partners, as well as students, faculty, and staff from our Native American community, because projects like this are all about consultation, conversations, and bringing these groups together to decide what would be best served by our communities. And so we are just still in the very initial stages of doing this work, but it is through these classes and through our Native American Studies program and the curriculum that we teach there that we are investigating these questions, that we are working with our students, working with the ARC, with the Native American Student Union to work with those students as well. So we will continue to have consultations about what would be the best way to honor and recognize Native American people here on our campus. And that might just look differently. And as we do those consultations and we think about what would be the best way to do that. But possible ideas are similar, either installations like the Talking Stones, or as well, it could be plaques or artwork, or planting traditional food and flowers from the seasonal round, a variety of different projects. So to end, I just really want to honor and recognize so many faculty, students, tribal community members who have really helped with this project. Again, I want to recognize the tribal elders from the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, particularly Esther Stutzman, their Culture and Heritage Department, their tribal council that also always works on these issues, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, their tribal council, their Culture and Heritage Department, and also tribal elders like Marta Lou Clifford and others, David Lewis, as well as David Harrelson, as well as the Native American Student Union, again, our Native American ARC and our Native Studies faculty. I want to recognize all the amazing work that these individuals do, as well as our Native American Strategies group, who works on projects like this as well, which is a collective of Native American staff, faculty, allied people across campus, and tribal community members. And it is through the work of these groups and these people that work like this is accomplished. And this is how we do that consultation work. And it's just been an honor and privilege to be able to work with groups like this, as well as work with some amazing students who also want to ensure that they make an impact as well. So thank you so much. And I look forward to our conversation.
So Jennifer, one of the questions that comes up often, I think, for both of us is the question of what people are learning in schools today in Oregon and more generally. And I wonder if you wanted to open with some information and thoughts both about what people are learning and what perhaps should be better integrated into particularly K-12 schools in Oregon and beyond.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for that question. Well, historically, the history of, or at least the accurate history of Native Americans had historically not been taught in K through 12 schools, or relegated to maybe a fourth grade unit, or then maybe another one in 8th grade, very short units that often missed so much of our history, or just relegated it to more of an overarching theme on settlers coming in and the relationships between settlers and Native Americans, and more of a that relationship that seemed more focused on it was more good relationships when it wasn't an accurate history, as well as you often got into to things about the Oregon Trail and Thanksgiving being these themes. However, because so many educators, particularly Native American educators, saw so many problems with that, there was a huge effort recently over the past 5 to 10 years to really advocate for a change in curriculum. So in 2017, the Oregon legislature enacted SB 13, Senate Bill 13, known as Tribal History, Shared History. And so this law directs the Oregon Department of Education to create K through 12 Native American curriculum for inclusion in Oregon public schools, and provides professional development to educators. It also directed ODE to provide funds to each of the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon to create individual place-based curriculum. So since that time, tribal educators working from the 9 tribes had been working with the state to develop that curriculum and to get it in place to be launched in K through 12 schools. And again, this was because for years the state had been missing this critical opportunity to fully leverage the strengths, assets, and contributions of Native American faculty and students and educators that they bring from their own communities. So this lack of accurate and complete curriculum may contribute to the persistent achievement and opportunity gaps between Native American and other students. So they really saw this as ways to meet those gaps and ensuring that we can teach youth about Oregon tribal history through the perspective and voice of Native American peoples, because there was just this general lack of knowledge. In addition to that, I just want to acknowledge some of the amazing work of our colleagues here at the University of Oregon in the College of Education, specifically through the Sapsaquala program, which is headed by Dr. Michelle Jacob and Dr. Leilani Sabzalian. And that is a program, a graduate program specifically for Native American students that helps them to earn their graduate degree in teaching to then go back to their tribal communities. And so that's an amazing program as well that's also helping to reverse a lot of and ensure that Native American history is centered, and as well as just more Native American educators are trained as well. And Mark, I know you want to tell us a little bit as well about SB 664. So tell us a little bit about that as well.
I do. Actually, I wanted to throw in just briefly, I think because I've noticed even among college professors who aren't trained in this, there's sometimes a temptation to want to talk about the very important deep Native history of the Northwest of Oregon or of the country, but then neglect talking about recent Native history, right? To stop, I know in my I got that fourth grade unit, and I had a teacher in fourth grade who talked a lot about Native experiences in the deep past, more than was standard at the time, but it cut off at Lewis and Clark. And so to make sure that these one of the very exciting things about the new curriculum is that it's speaking about Native nations, not just the deep past, but also the more recent past and the present, right? The Native nations, Indigenous people are very much still here and still a vital part of this land. I also, as you mentioned, just this year was finalized SB 664, which mandates the teaching of the history of genocide in K-12 with a particular but not exclusive focus on the Holocaust. And I think, and I'm working to try and make sure that teaching about local histories of genocide are a part of those curricula, right? They're just being made now, but that seems like a vital part. If you're going to learn about the history of genocide, you have to learn about the history of genocide in the land in which you live. And I think it's especially important that that becomes part of the curriculum, but doesn't subsume anything from the previous curriculum from SB 13. That the story, we need the story of Native nations in all ways, both the kind of endurance and history and culture, but also the story of the horrors of what I study. And so it is my hope that will become more and more integrated into the curriculums just now being made in response to that bill. And they're both great bills towards slowly but surely reversing all of these false histories that we both talked about.
So I was going to go ahead and ask Mark another question. Maybe something that we highlighted in both of our presentations was the importance of course, getting this, teaching the accurate and true history, and having the balance of both settler colonial history as well as Native American history. But I know a question we were both talking about was what lessons could be gleaned from the histories taught in Native nations, and what could Indigenous nations like to see changed as well? So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that, and then I will also mention mine as well.
Well, I'll say you're far more of an expert on this than I am, so I'll keep my comments short. I think I'll do the classic scholar thing and use your question to answer a different question, which is to say one of the things that's important in the work that I do, digging around in very musty, very white records of the past, is that there are Indigenous voices there that have been arguing for generations for a correct history. So one of the things that keeps me going in my work is that there are Native people who are writing in 1860, 1880, 1900, 1910 to historians saying this history of violence needs to be a part of the story that you're telling. And the historians of the past betrayed those letters and betrayed that trust. So that if I do nothing else, I hope that my work can bring those voices from Indigenous people in the past back into the historical conversation as they demanded to be recognized 100 years ago. I'll let you talk about the present, I think.
No, I think that's a great recommendation, and I would honor that as well too. I think what I would add, and something that can be learned from Native American communities and Native American educators, is decentering the state, the nation state, and just kind of historically how generally United States history has been taught is, of course, from contact to the present day, or it all centers around contact and then what happened after that. But what's so important is Native American history didn't just start from contact with Europeans. It started far before that. So what we can learn from Native American communities is that it's so important to begin from and center not only Native American history, but Native American ways of knowing and understanding the world, from oral traditions, from stories, from histories that are passed down through families and generations, and not just the histories and the facts, but also the issues and the feelings that are passed down from generations and families that are so important. So, and through a lot of the amazing Indigenous scholars that I build off of, who talk about just, it's a holistic way of learning. It isn't just facts, and it's bringing in families and land and connection to land and place, and reciprocal learning, and the importance of relationality to all of those things. So at the core is our relationships, not only with our families and place and oral traditions, but it's how all of those issues work together to tell our histories and to really connect with those. So I think that's something that we can learn from tribal communities in our own ways of learning from the past and then carrying that into the future. Mark, what other questions do we want to highlight?
Yeah, well, I think I'd maybe just add a little bit onto that I think one of the many things that can do is kind of decenter the United States-based narrative. And I think particularly, I think both of us at one point or another teach histories of the Pacific Northwest. And one of the things that's important to impart to students is that this isn't the only event, the events of the 1850s. The ones I said, those are not the only or necessarily the most important events in Native history. And I particularly, there's a Katsi traditional story that sees it as, well, this is the third great calamity that befell us, was the 1850s, but there were two before that, and we survived those two. So really spotlighting, as you said, kind of the feeling as well as the facts of history, and often that feeling is one of resilience and persistence and connection, right? That it's not just because the stories I happen to be telling are stories of horror. Those are not the only stories of Indigenous nations or Indigenous people or Indigenous America, if you like. And part of how you get to that is by listening to what stories and what histories are important to Indigenous people and Indigenous communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for adding that. I would echo that as well too, because I'm teaching Intro to Native Studies right now, and that's what I say from the beginning of the course as well, that oftentimes, yes, we're talking about very difficult things that have happened to Native American people, but we also balance that with the resilience and survivance of our people in celebrating where we are today, the celebration of restorations of our tribes and of the amazing leaders and businesses that are grown, and the just those things that also show our agency and survivance, rather than just focusing on the more horrific things that have happened. Yes, we do honor and recognize those, but we balance that with some of the really celebratory things that we want to honor as well. So the people know, particularly during this month of Native American Heritage Month, that while of course, this month is about honoring our history, we also honor and recognize where we are at today, the amazing beauty of our communities, and not only leaders and things that we have built and the programs that we manage, but just the survivance and resilience and where we are at today is something to be celebrated. I think one of the last questions we can touch on is, I know people have questioned, and we've already touched a little bit about kind of our sources or materials that we've worked with, but I know people are interested to know where they can either find more about our projects or how can they contribute. So Mark, do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. Well, I'd say, first of all, since you've heard this, you now have an obligation, if you didn't already know, to educate yourself on these issues, right? I understand, again, I grew up in Oregon. I understand coming into this with some ignorance of the truer history of Oregon. But once you know that that history is somewhat false, it is incumbent upon you to get a better understanding of the place and times in which you live. I'd say, for my part of it, I would also recommend, and this is good general practice, when you read histories, consider who wrote them and why. And a little bit of skepticism, or at least of checking sources, is warranted. But I would also say there's a burgeoning field, particularly of Indigenous scholars writ broadly, both of traditional knowledge and of academic knowledge, to read. And there's quite a lot of resources out there, including some of the ones you talked about and created. So I'm hopeful that you can chat a little bit more about how people can find those, kind of the nuts and bolts of those, to learn a little bit more about the Indigenous history of this region.
Yeah, and that's my recommendation as well, that there are so many amazing Native American scholars and projects that have been produced about our history, particularly here in the state of Oregon. And there's amazing texts and projects and oral history projects, and every tribe here in the state has a website, has books they have produced. And so if you're looking for ways that you can learn more, we highly encourage you to check out those books from your local library, buy them from the author, learn who they are, and become knowledgeable of those histories. There's some amazing authors out there who have dedicated their lives to this history. Our tribes have dedicated so many projects and initiatives to educating not only our own communities, but producing projects about our histories. Some of our tribes also have amazing museums and sites where you can actually go on and learn more. And there's exhibits online that you can also find out about. So we highly encourage you to go and learn our histories through these books, through the articles, through the websites, through museums, and start there and really pay attention to those projects that are being produced and educate yourself on that. And then of course, you can also go on and check out the projects that I talked about, the UO Hidden History Project. That's just hiddenhistory.uoregon.edu. And it takes you to some of those tours and to those sites that I talked about. And then if you go to the University of Oregon's map, you can go to the Indigenous UO map and see all of those different locations that we were talking about. You could take yourself to campus and go look for some of those locations, take yourself on a tour, do a self-guided tour from each of these projects. So that could be something that you do over maybe the rest of the month, or a goal you have for yourself is to go find one of those locations, learn more about it, and then tell more people about it. And then also, both Mark and I have produced articles and lots of other projects about the work that we do. So if you want to know more, you can check those out, and we will add those as part of this program as well. So I think our time is up, but we just want to thank everybody so much for being here and giving us this opportunity to have this wonderful discussion with you and to share this information. We hope it's really helped you to have a better idea of some of this history, and we hope that you go learn more. So thanks for being with us today.
I want to echo that. Thank you so much. I think historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future. But I think one thing that many of us would agree with is that we need a future that is different from the past in certain vital ways, perhaps with some amount of truth and reconciliation. And the only way to get to truth and reconciliation is to start with getting to the truth. So I would echo Jennifer and encourage you to pursue a quest for the truth beyond what you can get in a short program like this one. Thank you so much.
This has been our November 20th, 2020 program, Rewriting the History of Oregon. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize some gold sponsors. Evans, Elder, Brown, and Subert, Emergency Veterinary Hospital, and Homes for Good. Before we thank our speakers today, there are a few quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, Dotson's Photography, and a special thank you to public radio station KLCC 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. And thank you to Community Television of Lane County, Cable Channel 29, for televising recent City Club programs. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. Next week, we will take a break to observe a time of reflection and spend time with family, but also honor the 2-week freeze put into place by Governor Brown. We return to regularly scheduled programs on December 4th with our program, COVID is Back. We will welcome 4 speakers, 2 from Lane County Public Health, Dr. Patrick Ludke and Ellen Thornton Love, and 2 from Peace Health, Dr. James McGovern and Dr. Leslie Palinka. You may send questions for upcoming programs to the City Club's Executive Director. The program's moderator will select those questions to be asked for each program. Send your questions to administrator@cityclubofeugene.org. Please join us again on Friday, December 4th. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website, cityclubofeugene.org. Now, I would like to thank today's speakers for a very fine program. Moderator Joel Corin and presenters Mark Carpenter and Jennifer ONeal. Thank you so much. This concludes today's program. Be well and stay safe.